Hey, Pastor Cody here. Thanks for checking into the YouTube channel. From time to time, I like to share about books that I think are particularly good. And I want to share one with you today. This might actually be two videos. I want to share a little bit of some of the things that are in the book as well to kind of give you a taste for it. But the book that I want to talk about is The Christian Family by Herman Bavinck. So Bavinck was a pastor, a Dutch pastor, a son of a Dutch pastor. He was a Dutch pastor himself. He was born in 1854, and he wrote this book, first published in 1908, and then republished in 1912, and then I believe in 2012, 100 years afterwards, it was translated from Dutch into English and then published here in the United States in English. But it popped up a couple places last year on lists that people would share of books, you must read books. And so I thought, man, I've seen it a couple of times. I better pick it up and read it. And it is not only a really good book, but incredibly relevant today. So Bavinck was a pastor who was particularly countering the effects of the French Revolution on Dutch society and in the Dutch church and in what people believed, and presenting biblical apology to those philosophical ideas. And a lot of those same ideas have filtered down over the last 100 years and into a lot of churches today. And so I think that's where this book can be really helpful, because a lot of the issues that he is talking about are similar kinds of things as we're dealing with. And so the biblical reasoning that he is presenting and the exegesis he's presenting are the same kinds of things that we need to know about. So I want to give just kind of a brief overview, perhaps of the first part. So the book is at least as I divide the book, it starts with a few chapters moving from the origin of the family, the fall, the family among the nations. So from the fall until the people of Israel enter the promised land, the family in Israel, and the family in the New Testament. And then the second half of the book, he kind of takes that sort of theological base that he has laid and then applies it to different issues about the family in his own time. And I think both are pretty helpful to us. But let me share a few things, something from each of the first few chapters. So the first chapter really lays the essential groundwork. And he talks particularly about the relationship between how man and woman are created and the particular roles that they are to have. And I think that's something that we have generally lost today, that there is a fundamental relationship, that God created things in a particular order, and that order that he created things in, or created us in, the physical and biological, physiological, psychological differences between man and woman actually relate to the roles that God gives each in their lives. And I think the problem is we don't realize how much evolutionary theory has actually infiltrated our base assumptions. And he kind of points some of those things out, that not relating those two things is actually assuming evolution, even if we don't say that, even if we don't realize that's what we're doing, that things are actually created in a chaotic order, and we're just trying to kind of figure it out. And so, God gave us some rules, some roles, a few commands to sort of hem in the chaos that is creation. When in reality, God created us particularly, and he's ordered all of creation, and it's sin that's come in and distorted those things. And so, for instance, he says God is the creator of the human being and simultaneously also the inaugurator of sex and sexual difference. The difference did not result from sin. It existed from the very beginning. It has its basis in creation. It is a revelation of God's will and sovereignty. and is therefore wise and holy and good. Therefore, no one may misconstrue or despise his sexual difference, either within one's own identity or in another, or in that of another person. It has been willed by God and grounded in nature. And so the distortion of how we are created, the order in which we are created, male and female, or even the despising of that, to say, oh man, I don't like this about being a man, or I don't like about being a woman, in ourselves or in someone else, is sinful, essentially. He says each of the two has a unique nature, character, and vocation. And so he works from man being created first and woman second, just as Paul does in the New Testament, and kind of goes from there. And then he moves into talking about sin and how it disrupted it, and he differentiates between the sin of Eve and the sin of Adam. And he says Adam did not fall in the same way that Eve fell. Eve fell in terms of covetousness. She fell because she believed that eating the fruit would make her like God. Essentially, he says she became a teacher to Adam when Adam was supposed to be a teacher to her. And he says Adam fell, however, because his love for his wife surpassed his love for God. And so those sins then relate to the curse. But what I love about when he's talking about the different curses that come to us and the differences between how they affect men and women is he sort of unpacks how the curse is bad in some sense, but also how God weaves in a blessing into each of the curses. He weaves in this element that is actually a good side that helps to perpetuate life, even though we bear this curse that leads to death. And so God's grace is displayed to all of humanity through that. He then goes on to talk about the family among the nations. And particularly in this chapter, what he does is he gives a sort of a survey, I suppose, of how the thought process at the time was in terms of how an evolutionist would see the development of family order through time, and the different sort of sinful or evil iterations of that, or maybe some they didn't think were evil. I'm not sure particularly on that, but essentially what he says is they think that it, again, because they think that everything started disorderly and man has to come in here like as if man is God and sort of put things into order. They think that we've sort of developed towards a better and better things, but in reality, all of these sins have always existed alongside of one another. And some are more popular or more prevalent at different times than at other times, and in different places than other places. But this is what conclusion he comes to. He says, "For these terrible sins hardly appear only in the most extreme measure among the coarsest of people, but they are found in their most rampant forms among civilized and developed societies." So he fights against this idea that these terrible sins, they only happen among uncivilized people. Now that we're civilized, it's not so bad. Well, he says, no, actually, if one wishes to uncover and observe them here, then one must not go to the isolated, tranquil villages, but to the center of civilization, to the focal points of culture, to the large cities full of grandeur and glory. And he essentially says that we've just become very refined in the way that we go about these sins and the way that we excuse them and hide them. And that terrible, refined manner actually reveals that we're created in the image of God and not in the image of an ape, because animals they don't have the ability to figure out how to be so refined as that. And so even our proficiency in sinning actually works to reveal the image of God in us. He moves on to the family under Israel, and particularly discussing some of the issues that have to do with the law and sort of presumptions that the Mosaic law is somehow against women and children, particularly. And so he kind of unpacks some of those things that the law is actually good in and was a great, it's a great advancement in these things. But particularly about the lack, the perceived lack of laws regarding or describing the rights of wives and children, he again places this confusion on an evolutionary presumption. He says, nowadays people frequently allege that conclusion, but this view proceeds from the theory of evolution, again, which teaches on its own nature is chaotic and a disorderly situation, a battle of everyone against everyone else. And in such a situation, order is created only through the legislation of the state. And we certainly see that today. So there's an assumption that if you say that man, for instance, a husband is to be the head of the household, that what you're saying is that man ends up winning this sort of chaotic battle with women, and rather than starting from a Christian worldview, a biblical worldview, saying, no, this is how God created things, and it's actually good for men and women when men rightly take the responsibility as head of their household, and women rightly honor and submit to them, that this is actually good for everyone. It's good not only for everyone in that family, but it's good for all of society. And he says that the evolutionist replaces that, God's order, with the legislation of the state, that man is viewed essentially as a wild animal that is tamed and turned into a man only by the state. The state becomes the great domesticator and nurturer of humanity, the source of all rights, the creator and shaper of society. So the state then has to fill that gap because we don't believe that God exists, and sort of be God for us, that the state gives us our rights, not that God has ordered things and given us our rights. And he sort of comes down to this. In short, it's a disbelief in the creation and providence of God. So I thought that was helpful. But he sort of proceeds from that into the New Testament, and his conclusion in the New Testament is essentially this, that in the face of all this, he says, we find that the Christian faith brought peace to many a heart and returned love to many a home. And so he says, well, marriage isn't sort of principally a Christian institution, because it actually was created at the very beginning. But that doesn't mean that it's a creation of the state. It is created by God. God gave it. It's a gift of God, and he is over it. You are married under God, whether you believe that God exists or not. And yet, because of that, it's sort of brought into the Christian life in that way. And he says Christianity did not overthrow the natural ordinances like marriage and institutions, but infused a new spirit in them, reforming them from within. It did not liberate wives from their husbands, or children from their parents, or servants from their masters, or workers from their vocations, or subjects from the state. But Christianity made for better wives and children, manservants, maidservants, workers, and citizens, or husbands for that matter, and led them back to their respective relationships. Christianity provided spiritual liberation, and precisely in that way recreated earthly relationships. And so he's combating some of the same kinds of things that we're combating today, that essentially turn the gospel into this idea of sort of social liberation, oppressed being liberated from the oppressor. And he says, no, this order isn't bad. The oppression comes from sin and from the malforming of that order. And so grace is not in competition with nature. Rather, grace is restoring nature back to how it ought to have been without sin, or even we could say that Christ is resurrecting it to even a glorified state, or will eventually. And so anyway, those are some of kind of his biblical conclusions. And then the second half, he is going to talk about some of the dangers to the Christian family and how marriage and family and nurture and how that works in society and all of those things. And so it's interesting as he works through those things, how almost prophetic, he is in seeing kind of what was coming down the road, things that now are in the past or in our present today. So we'll share about that later. Thanks for listening, and I hope it's helpful. And if you are up for a good book, then I would highly recommend The Christian Family to you. All right, we'll see you later.